Live right here on this second day of 2025 on the early line on SportsGrid, a day we did not anticipate, previewing a college football playoff game. Originally scheduled for New Year's Day, a triple header and a nightcap in New Orleans in the Sugar Bowl between 2-seed Georgia and 7-seed Notre Dame. But of course, after the early morning hours and a terrorist attack in the Big Easy, in the French Quarter, a driver plowing a car through a pedestrian crowd on Bourbon Street, killing 15 people, injuring more than 35 others. It is with heavy hearts and a lot of significance that we look at today's Sugar Bowl as it was rescheduled from 8:45 last night to 4 p.m. Eastern on this Thursday. Before we get into the game, DRS, I do feel it bears repeating. It's a really strange circumstance to be playing this game. The right decision was made yesterday to postpone it until this afternoon. It's a weird dichotomy that sports often operates in. The real world, and where really significant and oftentimes tragic things can play out that also impact the sports landscape. But sport at its best, college football at its best, is filled with passion, excitement, tradition, pageantry, and can be an escape from harder times. It is going to be an interesting atmosphere, of course, in the Big Easy, and for a community that is reeling. All of our love and thoughts with everybody impacted by the terror attack in New Orleans. So that atmosphere will be a little bit strange for the Sugar Bowl. I hope, in its essence, it can provide a little bit of relief from what is going on right now in the matchup that we will have between Georgia and Notre Dame.
Yeah, there's going to be a lot of emotion in this building, and not just the emotion from the college football playoff being in town and both of these teams' fan bases being excited. The emotion of you just witnessed a tragedy, but as you said, Ben, life still goes on. How do they recognize this? Because they've also been talking to most of the coaching staffs. I know Notre Dame talking about rallying for New Orleans. We'll probably see a patch or a sticker on the helmet, and we'll get a lot of this stuff up to the pregame here, even though it's not a night game at this point. So understand this. Life goes on, but compassion also goes along with life, and you're going to find that out tonight. Yeah. These kids also have the ability to compartmentalize all of this that's going on. And also keep in mind, this isn't something, Ben, where they're playing in the Rose Bowl and this took place in Miami Beach. It's oh, that's devastating, but it's tough to think about. You are in town. You're thinking about what happens if this was a day or two earlier, because the kids, what they want to do. Who doesn't want to see Bourbon Street when you're in New Orleans at that point? Probably walking along that same path days early and thinking about, boy, that could have been me. Or how about this, when you hear this tragedy, their family and friends and the fan bases are in town. What they were thinking right away when they woke up and heard this was my dad there, was my mom there, was my brother there, was my best friend down on the street. So it's amazing the ability that these athletes have to rise to the occasion and say, you know what, we still have a job to do on the football field, understanding the devastating fatalities, I should say, that happened on Bourbon Street, but we still have a football game to play, and we owe it to our fan bases and the nation to play it to above our best, because as we know as U.S. citizens, life goes on, man. Nothing's going to keep us down, tragedy or not. You're going to show your best face at this moment, and those kids are going to do that tonight for us.
And just because a football game is being played in New Orleans does not mean the scene in New Orleans outside of the Superdome feels any less hectic or devastating at this moment. But the game will be played at 4 p.m. Eastern time. You hope to not be inconsiderate, but express some compassion and allow football to be a little bit of that reprieve for more difficult things happening elsewhere. The game itself, the Sugar Bowl, and a spot in the college football playoff semifinal exactly 1 week from today in South Beach against Penn State in the Orange Bowl. It's the 2-seed Georgia and the 7-seed Notre Dame. In terms of the odds, we have seen a flip, even if it is as slight as 3 cents on the money line. For most of this week, Georgia was a slight favorite, 2.5 points. 1.5 points. Yesterday on New Year's Day, a slight favorite on the money line. They were minus 111. Notre Dame was minus 108. But Donnie, 3 cents is 3 cents. It is basically a pick'em. So tell us, who wins the Sugar Bowl in New Orleans on this Thursday afternoon?
If Carson Beck was still the quarterback for Georgia, and I always preface this by saying he probably didn't have the season he thought he was going to have, I'd be leaning towards Georgia winning this football game, and that spread would not be plus 1.5 for Georgia at the FanDuel Sportsbook. They would be a favorite. So that's good. So now that adjusted into the line. But I do think Notre Dame, if the structure comes down to who can move the football easily, I don't know if that's going to happen, which is why you have that total bet at 45.5. We're not looking at 55.5, 65.5, a shootout that's going to take place. But when the plays need to be made, can Gunnar Stockton make those plays? Or is he just going to try to make some plays with his feet? The one thing we do know, Riley Leonard has played a lot of college football in his career. He's taken thousands of snaps. He's been in big game environments already. Now, you do like the fact that Gunnar Stockton was inserted into the last game they played and finally pulled out a championship, which was kind of crazy. But he wasn't the catalyst for that. He was just basically, okay, let me make a few plays here and there, not try to make mistakes, even though he had an interception. So for me, at the most important position in sports, Notre Dame has a big advantage. And as we pointed out, is there a big advantage between SEC Georgia's defense and Notre Dame's defense at this point? I think you could maybe call that a coin toss at this point, maybe give the leg up to Notre Dame here. So for me, I'm looking at Notre Dame. I think Notre Dame wins this football game, Ben.
Statistically, Notre Dame has been the better defense all year long. But Georgia, in its biggest games of the year, has always risen to the occasion. It is what Kirby Smart does better than anybody else currently in this sport. He is a master motivator. He can take a false narrative that he begins and make it seem like a theme for his team the entirety of a season. To what I am referencing, in the two matchups against Texas, for a Georgia defense that, based on the stats, has been as bad as we have seen in the last 5 years in Athens. But in their two biggest games in each against Texas, including with an SEC title at stake, Georgia matched the moment. They allowed, against the Longhorns, who, of course, will play in the college football playoff semifinal as well, 60 total rushing yards over the course of two games on 55 total attempts from Texas. That is 1.1 yard per carry for a Georgia defense that all year has allowed 128 yards per game on average, including the Texas matchups. That would be the worst mark since 2018. And that will be the biggest challenge, DRS, for UGA's defense. A Notre Dame rushing attack that is top 10 in the country, averaging 222 yards per game, where the quarterback, Riley Leonard, can utilize his athleticism alongside a great duo in the backfield of Jeremiah Love and Jadarian Price. We'll see if Georgia can answer the bell once again. But the biggest question for this game is no doubt the starter for Georgia at the quarterback spot, making his first career start. That is Gunnar Stockton. 175.5 is his number. This will be his fourth appearance of the season. The second half and OT in the SEC championship game. 12-16, 71 yards, and an interception. He also carried it 8 times for 8 yards, showing a little bit of athleticism. The previous 2 appearances that Gunnar Stockton made this year against UMass and Tennessee Tech in routes. But I will say this, DRS. I talked about Kirby Smart being the master motivator. Maybe it's coach speak, but it feels like UGA's mentality. Kirby and the rest of this roster believes in the sophomore from Tiger, Georgia. Kirby, in the lead up to this game, said that Gunnar Stockton makes the other players around him play harder. Kind of a shot to Carson Beck, but also could be a resounding sentiment for what this Georgia team feels about its new starting signal caller.
It is kind of crazy, the narrative that we're building around this, too, because you're even hearing like, well, hey, Carson Beck drives around in a Lambo around campus. This guy drives a 1982 truck with 3. I mean, I understand you want to build them up, and Kirby Smart's not going to be you know what? Once we got Carson Beck hurt at the half, you know what? I don't even want to go to college football playoff. It's not fair to the other teams. We're not as good without Carson Beck. They have to pump him up. But even some of the kids talking about it, players on the team, boy, in practice, man, I mean, he's a fearless quarterback. Like, we know they're going to say that. But understand this.
Right.
This isn't a walk-on freshman that was 6th string that somehow found his way into this picture. That's a 5-star recruit who was damn good in high school.
We'll talk about the players that will impact the outcome next, as we get you set for the Sugar Bowl in New Orleans. Now we look at the player props and the individuals that, of course, will dictate the outcome of our final college football playoff quarterfinal. DRS, this is our 8th game of the first ever 12-team CFP. It features the lowest total at 45 and a hook of any of the 8. So how much offense will we see? How many overs might we see from these player props listed on your screen, with the biggest question for the actual football game? Gunnar Stockton, Georgia's new starting quarterback. 175 in a hook is his passing yards prop. Donnie, if he goes over that, is it necessarily a great thing for Georgia, or could it mean they are trailing and playing from behind for most of the football game?
I don't think it's that case. I actually think he would be playing from ahead in the first half, which means that they're going to be more aggressive and he might be able to hit some of those shots. And by the way, FanDuel Sportsbook, as you see that graphic, 175.5, now up to 181.5 here live for him. So people are betting that Gunner's going to have a decent football game. Riley Leonard at the 180.5, and then the passing touchdown market here. Over 1.5, which means each one of these quarterbacks will throw 2 touchdowns, plus 174 for Stockton, plus 205 for Riley Leonard. So those games that you think will be a little bit lower scoring, you're going to get that added boost if you think there might be a semblance of offense. But for me, it's not necessarily the pass, throwers. It's the pass catchers that we're going to look at in a few moments. But if you said, Donnie, which quarterback would you actually take to go over that number? To be honest, I think it might be Gunnar Stockton. I really do. Because I think his weapons at wide receiver are more in tune for the big play than Notre Dame's weapons at wide receiver to do that.
And again, Notre Dame operates under Mike Denbrock with Riley Leonard, an experienced quarterback, oftentimes like the triple option. Riley Leonard running the football, Jeremiah Love running the football with excellence in Jadarian Price as well. It is not necessarily shotgun, spread it out, drop back, air it down the field, 45-plus yards. Riley Leonard in the opening CFP game against Indiana, 23 of 32, 201 yards, a touchdown, albeit that early interception that was deflected. The 32 attempts for Riley Leonard against IU, tied for the second most he has had this year. His most this season in a Notre Dame uniform, 33. They are not looking to air it out against this Georgia defense that has struggled to contain the run in large part this year outside of each of their 2 matchups against Texas. Georgia has played 4 games against 3 teams that reached the college football playoff. They are perfect, 4-0 straight up and against the spread. The other 9, UGA is 0-9 ATS. Notre Dame against non-MAC opponents, 10-0-1 against the number, with an average margin of victory at nearly 28 points per game, with a scoring offense putting up 42 points per game in those 11, over in 7 of the 11. But DRS, again, you see that total right there, 45 and a hook. You mentioned the pass catchers for either side. Who has your attention for the Sugar Bowl and the Big Easy?
Well, that's the question, right? But also, as we just talked about the quarterbacks, 180, 175.5, we're talking about those numbers. The highest priced wide receiver tonight is going to be Arian Smith for Georgia, 36.5. You have starters out here, Ben, that have played hundreds of snaps this year in the 20s. You just have to make that decision where you don't get left out. But for me, it's probably more looking towards Arian Smith and a Dylan Bell on Georgia as it is, opposed to looking at Notre Dame's players, because there's not a lot of catches, not a lot of yards, and not a lot of touchdowns on their side of the ball. So for me, it probably is, because the one thing that you do know, even though Smith has the 36.5, he makes a lot of his yardage bet on what? Those rocket screens out quickly here, where he's got the speed to get deep. And also talking about the speed to get deep, where it's not like, hey, I need 5 catches to get 36.5 yards. He might only need 3. And yes, they will be passing in this game. It's not just going to be running as if it's played in a snow bowl or a mud bowl at this point. So somebody's going to have to make plays. So for me, Ben, it's more Georgia wideouts than it is Notre Dame.
Gunnar Stockton's rushing yards prop on the rise, 27.5. Again, 8 scrambles for 8 yards in the second half of the SEC championship game and in overtime. Riley Leonard, who has rushed for at least 30 yards in 12 of 13 games for the Irish this year. His prop, much higher than that, 44 and a hook. But you saw it in the matchup against the Hoosiers, the play that changed the outcome of that game very early in the opening quarter. Jeremiah Love in the 98-yard dash to score a touchdown. Outside of that, Notre Dame did not do much on the ground. 93 yards on 34 other carries against Indiana, who was the nation's best rushing defense all year long. But Jeremiah Love, DRS, is as good as you will find at the running back spot. He dealt with a knee injury in the final few weeks of the regular season. Maybe wasn't fully 100% entering that matchup against Indiana. And they haven't had the layoff that Georgia has had since the SEC championship game but still over a week since that Friday night affair in South Bend. Jeremiah Love, this is crazy because I bet it because I was in New Jersey yesterday and could bet it entering our college football today CFP preview special. Jeremiah Love yesterday to score a touchdown was plus 105. He's now minus 150. That's ridiculous. The minus 150 price is what I think is the true representative number because Jeremiah Love has scored a touchdown in all 13 games for Notre Dame this season.
Yeah, he doesn't need a goal line carry to get it done. Like, ooh, get inside the 5, he's going to get it. This guy's a home run hitter with the best of them in football. Also, running back position, Trevor Etienne from Georgia. He was sort of a surprise that he appeared in that SEC championship game. Now with extra weeks here. And then that game, 16 carries, 94 yards, and 2 touchdowns in that game against Texas, one of the better defenses. You now see him lined up at 88.5. He also should find pay dirt. But if we're talking about getting guys some extra reps here, and with a quarterback that doesn't have a lot of reps being a starter for UGA, Trevor Etienne is probably going to be the key. You can probably focus, Ben, and say, if Etienne gets 70 yards or less, Notre Dame's probably going to beat them. But if Etienne gets that 88.5 or more, they're probably going to win this football game. So that's probably the most singular important guy in this football game is Georgia running back Trevor Etienne.
And Notre Dame held Indiana to just 63 yards, but the Irish's rushing defense has been a little bit susceptible this season. Speaking of injuries, Riley Mills, one of the best defensive linemen in the country for Notre Dame, injured against IU, is going to miss the remainder of this college football playoff. Donnie Rightside, always a pleasure, my friend. We send you off into the money line, and we send you off into a huge regular season finale weekend in the NFL. I'll talk to you on Monday. Going to be a big Monday, right? Coach firings, all of that. Talk to you then. Happy New Year once again. More in college football next. Live right here on the early line, our first edition of TEL in this new year of 2025 on the second day of this calendar year. A Sugar Bowl today in New Orleans, set to kick at 4 p.m. Eastern time. Of course, postponed from last night in what was supposed to be the nightcap in New Orleans of a college football playoff tripleheader after the early morning terror attack in the Big Easy in the French Quarter. So postponed from 8:45 p.m. yesterday to 4 p.m. Eastern on January 2nd. It is going to be an interesting atmosphere as we have detailed numerous times throughout these 3 hours here on the early line. More so for the atmosphere and the fans and what feels like it should be an exciting game that, of course, has to pay reverence to the serious nature of what is still unfolding in New Orleans. For the game itself, it's the 2-seed Georgia, it's the 7-seed Notre Dame. The Irish now an ever so slight favorite, but again, this is basically a pick where things stand. Notre Dame has one loss this year in 13 games early on in September against Northern Illinois, one of the largest upsets this season in college football. And against non-MAC foes, because Notre Dame also played Miami of Ohio a few Saturdays later and struggled in that game early against the Red Hawks. Against non-MAC foes in 11 games this year, Notre Dame is 10-0-1 against the spread. They have been decisive. They have been dominant. You heard from somebody earlier on this show that Notre Dame was not all that impressive and dominant against Indiana. I would argue actually quite the opposite based on the final result. Indiana scored 2 touchdowns in the final 90 seconds of that game. The Irish in full command the entirety, basically, of 58 minutes in South Bend on that snowy Friday night to start the first ever 12-team college football playoff. I have shared, if I have not on the air, I bet the Irish with this game opened up for the CFP quarterfinal in the Sugar Bowl on the money line. When Notre Dame was the slight underdog, now they are a slight favorite. 45.5 is that total. I'll just say this. I think the best route for Georgia to win is under the number because I believe Notre Dame's success comes from a rushing attack that has been excellent all year long. That is the biggest advantage that Marcus Freeman and the Irish have in this matchup. But Kirby Smart is as good as anybody. Maybe not even as good, is better than anybody in college football on getting his team prepared for a monumental moment, for a biggest game and stage of a season. It is why in 2 matchups against a darn good Texas rushing attack and offense, Georgia has held the Longhorns to 60 total yards, in 2 games combined on 55 total attempts. That is 1.1 yard per pop. That is elite. In the other games this year, though, Georgia has struggled to stymie the run. See the 8 overtime thriller to end out the regular season against Georgia Tech for your proof. That is the key for Notre Dame. The success of Riley Leonard utilizing his legs, playing clean football. Jeremiah Love and Jadarian Price on the ground as well. I shared it. I bet Love's anytime touchdown prop yesterday at plus 105. It's now minus 150 for a guy that has scored in all 13 games for the Irish this season. But the biggest X factor of this game in the Sugar Bowl and potentially the remainder of the CFP is Gunnar Stockton, the sophomore from Tiger, Georgia, who has the full belief of his football program making his first career start today in the biggest stage of the season for the Bulldogs, still hunting down a 3rd national championship in the last 4 years. His passing yards prop on the rise, 181.5. 16 attempts in the second half and overtime of the SEC championship game. 16 total pass attempts in his only 2 other outings this season. The winner of today's game will face off with Penn State exactly 1 week from tonight in the Orange Bowl in Miami in the college football playoff semifinal. Both the Bulldogs and the Irish project to be a slight favorite against Penn State. The Nittany Lions as an underdog, not nearly as good as when they are expected to win a football game outright. And as we speak about the SEC, Lane Kiffin been doing a lot of talking throughout bowl season about the strength of a conference that has really not lived up to expectation just yet. In the Gator Bowl today in Jacksonville, the Runnin' Rebs, with a kickoff that is slightly delayed until 8 p.m. Eastern time to make space for the Sugar Bowl, has an opportunity at least to make a statement. Don't forget, Ole Miss did beat Georgia in Oxford earlier in the regular season. 17.5-point spread in favor of the Rebs against 9-win Duke. The early line returns tomorrow on a Football Friday at 8 a.m. Eastern.